I had the envelope in my hand for a full minute before I opened it. It came in the mail on a Tuesday. Nothing special about the day. Cloudy. A little cold. The kind of October morning where you pour a second cup of coffee just to have something warm to hold. My name was on the front. My address. But the return address was from a financial services company I'd never done business with in my life. Inside was a loan agreement. $43,000. Secured against my property. With my signature on it. I didn't yell. I didn't call anyone. I just sat down at the kitchen table, set the envelope beside my coffee mug, and read the whole thing twice. Then I folded it carefully, put it back inside, and placed it next to the fruit bowl like it was a grocery receipt, because I already knew, somewhere in the back of my mind, that this moment was coming. I just didn't know it would arrive in an envelope on a Tuesday. My name is Theodore. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer. Bridges, drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure work nobody thinks about until it fails. I retired early, took a modest pension, and moved back to the house I grew up in outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. 3 acres, a workshop in the back, a creek you can hear from the porch if it's quiet enough. It's not fancy, but it's mine. It was my parents' before it was mine, and I'd planned on keeping it that way. My son's name is Owen. He's 34, graduated from University of Tennessee with a business degree, which I paid for. Got a job in commercial real estate in Nashville, which I helped him get settled for by covering his first and last month's rent and security deposit when he moved at 22. I don't say any of this to keep score. I say it because you need to understand who I thought my son was and how long it took me to see who he'd become. He married a woman named Sloan 3 years ago. She came from money. Her father owned a chain of auto dealerships across Middle Tennessee. Her mother was a real estate attorney. Sloan herself worked in marketing, drove a car that cost more than my first house, and had very clear opinions about everything, including, as it turned out, me. The wedding was their idea from the beginning. Destination event, a venue outside of Asheville, North Carolina, 112 guests. Live band, open bar, custom floral arrangements, a photographer who flew in from Atlanta, and a videographer who charged by the hour. Owen came to me 6 months before and laid it all out on a spreadsheet. I remember sitting across from him at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd later open that envelope, and watching him scroll through line items on his laptop. The total came to $88,000. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I've thought about it a lot. I didn't ask why Sloan's family wasn't contributing. I didn't ask why 2 people with incomes and careers couldn't cover their own wedding. I just looked at my son's face, and I saw something I recognized. That hopefulness. The way he used to look at me when he was 12 and wanted something he wasn't sure I'd say yes to. And I said yes. I liquidated a portion of my retirement account, took the tax hit, wired the money in 2 installments. At the rehearsal dinner, Sloan's father gave a toast. He talked about his daughter's grace and intelligence, how proud he was, how much he admired Owen for the man he'd become. He never mentioned me, not once. I was seated at a table near the back of the private room, next to 2 of Sloan's cousins I'd never met, while my ex-wife, Owen's mother, sat near the front because Sloan's family had known her longer through some mutual social connection I still don't fully understand. I told myself it was just seating, just a dinner. I told myself these things because I wanted them to be true. The wedding itself was beautiful. I'll give them that. The venue sat on a hillside with a view of the mountains, and the ceremony was in the late afternoon when the light comes in golden and long. I watched my son stand at the altar, and I felt the thing you're supposed to feel. Proud, a little heartbroken, the way all parents are, glad he'd found someone. I took pictures on my phone from the 7th row. I was in the 7th row. I'd written the check for $88,000, and I was in the 7th row. That night at the reception, I danced with no one because I didn't know most of the guests, ate a meal I could have cooked better myself, and drove 2 hours back to my hotel alone because I wasn't in the wedding party and hadn't been assigned a room block. 3 weeks later, Owen called me, not to say thank you, not to share honeymoon photos. He called to tell me, calmly and without much preamble, that Sloane wasn't comfortable with me dropping by unannounced, and that going forward they'd appreciate it if I scheduled visits in advance, a week's notice preferably. I said, "Owen, I live 45 minutes away." He said, "I know, Dad. It's just easier this way." I want to tell you that was the worst of it. But it wasn't even close. Over the next 8 months, the visits I requested were declined more often than not. Thanksgiving that year, I was told they were doing it small, just immediate family. I wasn't included in that definition apparently, so I ate a frozen lasagna and watched football by myself. Christmas I was invited, but told to come after noon and leave by 4, because Sloane's family was coming in the evening and they needed time to transition. I started noticing other things too. Owen stopped calling on weekends, which he'd done every Sunday for years. When I texted, the responses came hours later, short and vague. When I mentioned the property, asking if he wanted to come out and help me clear a section of fence line like we used to, he said he'd try but never did. Then his wife started calling me instead. Sloane called me twice in February. The first call was pleasant, almost warm, asking how I was doing, whether I'd seen a doctor lately, making small talk about the property. I thought maybe things were turning around. The second call, 2 weeks later, was different. She mentioned in passing that Owen worried about me being out there alone, that the property was a lot to maintain for someone my age, that they'd been talking about it. I was 61. I ran 5 miles 3 times a week. I'd just replaced the roof on my workshop by myself, but I just said, "I appreciate the concern," and left it there. That was when I started paying closer attention. I have a habit from my engineering days. I document things, not obsessively, just as a practice. Dates, conversations, decisions. I kept a small notebook in my truck for 30 years to log site visits, and the habit never left me. After Sloane's second call, I started keeping notes again. I wrote down dates, what was said, who called whom. I'm not sure why exactly. It was instinct more than anything else. In March, Owen drove out to the property without calling first, which I found ironic, given the conversation about unannounced visits. He walked the perimeter with me, asked questions about the deed, about how the property was titled, about whether I'd updated my estate documents since Mom died. He framed it all as concern. Planning ahead, being responsible. I answered his questions honestly, because he was my son, and I believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt until they prove you wrong. He proved me wrong in April. My neighbor, a woman named Patsy, who's lived on the adjoining land for 20 years, came over one afternoon and mentioned almost casually, the way neighbors do, that she'd seen a man in a truck parked at the end of my drive taking photographs of the property. She'd thought it was the county assessor at first, but the truck wasn't marked. She described the man, young, dark jacket, baseball cap. Not Owen. I thanked her and didn't think much of it that day. Then, at the beginning of May, I got a call from my bank, a loan officer I'd never spoken to, asking me to confirm some details on a recent application. I told him I hadn't made any recent application. There was a long pause on the line. "Mr. Theodore," he said carefully, "we have a signed application here for a home equity line of credit, $43,000 secured against your primary residence." I kept my voice level. I asked him to hold. I walked to the kitchen drawer, got a notepad and a pen, came back to the phone, and asked him to read me every detail on that application. The date, the address listed for correspondence, the phone number provided for contact. The phone number wasn't mine. I told the loan officer that I had not submitted that application, that my signature had been used without my authorization, and that he should flag the application immediately and not process anything further. He was professional about it, thanked me, said he'd escalate it internally. Before he hung up, he told me this wasn't the first inquiry they'd received about the property in the past 60 days. I sat with that for a moment. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Denise, and she's been handling my legal work since I bought the property 15 years ago. I told her everything. The loan application, the photographs Patsy had seen, the conversations with Owen about the deed, the calls from Sloan. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about her. When I finished, she said, "Theodore, I want you to do something for me before we do anything else. Don't change your behavior. Don't let on that you know. Just keep documenting." That's exactly what I did. I bought a small digital recorder, the kind that clips to a shirt pocket, and I carried it with me. Not for any dramatic purpose. Just because I'd learned in 30 years of engineering that having a record of something is always better than not having one. 2 weeks later, Owen called and asked if he could come by on Saturday. Said he and Sloan wanted to talk to me about some long-term planning. I said, of course, come for lunch. They arrived at noon. Sloan had brought a folder. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table, always the same table, and they laid out what they called a proposal. The core of it was this. They wanted me to sign over the property to a family trust, with Owen listed as the managing trustee. The justification was that it would protect the asset and simplify things if anything ever happened to me. They'd had documents drafted already. A notary was apparently available to come to the house that afternoon. I looked at the documents. I looked at my son. I looked at his wife, who was watching me with an expression I can only describe as patient. The kind of patience that isn't kindness, it's strategy. I said, "Can I have a few days to look these over?" Owen said, "Dad, it's pretty straightforward." Denise already looked at something similar for another client. Sloan checked. I said, "Which Denise?" Sloan said, very smoothly, "Your attorney." We reached out to get a sense of whether this kind of structure was standard. I didn't react. I picked up the folder. I said I'd read through it and get back to them. After they left, I called Denise immediately. She had never spoken to anyone on Owen's behalf. No one from his family had contacted her office. They had used her name to pressure me. A lie, clean and deliberate, designed to make me feel like the people around me had already agreed that this was fine, that I was the only holdout, that resistance was unnecessary. I sat in my workshop that evening for a long time. I had the recorder in my pocket. I had the folder on the workbench, and I had years of my son's childhood in my memory, teaching him to fish in that creek, helping him build a Pinewood Derby car, driving him to every single baseball game he played in until he was 16, sitting in the dark at the hospital when he broke his arm at 14 and was scared. I thought about all of it, and then I set it aside because I needed to think clearly. I called Denise the next morning. We met in her office and I brought everything, the recorder, the notes, the folder, the bank's information about the fraudulent application. She reviewed all of it carefully and then looked at me across her desk. She said, "This is elder financial exploitation. In Tennessee, that's a criminal offense." She said, "You have a choice. You can confront them, or you can get ahead of them." I chose to get ahead. The bank had already flagged the loan application for fraud investigation. With Denise's help, I filed a formal report with the Tennessee Adult Protective Services and the Knox County District Attorney's Office, which handles financial crimes against older adults. We documented the fraudulent application, the attempt to have me sign over the property under false pretenses, and the misrepresentation of my attorney's review. Then I did something else. The wedding, the $88,000 event I had paid for entirely, had been billed through several vendors who had a payment schedule with me directly. Since I was the one who had written the checks, 2 of those vendors, the venue and the catering company, had outstanding final balances that I had agreed to pay in installments after the event. Both installments were still pending, totaling just over $14,000, and both contracts were in my name. I called the venue first. I explained that I was involved in an active legal matter related to fraud connected to the event, and that I would not be able to authorize further payments until the matter was resolved. I was polite, I was factual, and I gave them Denise's contact information if they needed to follow up. Then I called the caterer. I didn't cancel out of spite. I want to be clear about that. I stopped payment because those contracts were in my name, with my money, and the people who had benefited from them were currently attempting to defraud me of my property. Releasing that money while legal proceedings were pending would have been reckless. Owen called me 3 days later. I could hear Sloan in the background. He said, "Dad, the venue is saying there's a payment issue. What's going on?" I said. "I've been advised not to discuss financial matters until some other things are resolved." "What other things?" "Dad, what are you talking about?" "You might want to speak with an attorney, Owen." He was quiet for a moment, then his voice changed. That measured, calibrated tone dropped, and what came through instead was something younger and raw. He said, "Dad, we were just trying to help you." I said, "I know you believe that." Then I said goodbye and ended the call. The investigation took several months. The Financial Crimes Unit looked at the loan application and traced the origin of the submission. It had been filed electronically using a device registered to a business address, connected to one of Sloane's family members. Owen maintained he hadn't known about the application specifically, and I don't have evidence to contradict that. Whether that's true, I genuinely don't know. What I know is that he knew about the trust documents, the pressure campaign, and the lie about my attorney, and he sat at my kitchen table and participated in all of it. The DA declined to pursue criminal charges against Owen directly, citing insufficient evidence of his personal involvement in the loan fraud. Sloane's family connection to the fraudulent filing was investigated, and as far as I know, that matter is still unresolved. The bank closed the fraudulent application and removed any associated marks from my credit record. The property is still mine. I want to tell you what happened with Owen, because I think people expect a particular ending to stories like this. The son comes back, realizes what he's done. There's a tearful conversation at the kitchen table. Some kind of repair. I want to be honest with you about what actually happened instead. He called me in the spring, about 4 months after everything came to a head. He said he wanted to talk. I said I was willing to listen. He came alone. No folder, no Sloan in the background, and sat across from me like he had when he was 20 and had made a mistake he wasn't sure I'd forgive. He didn't apologize exactly. He said things were complicated, that he'd made decisions he wasn't proud of, that he'd been influenced by people who had different priorities than he did. I listened to all of it. And then I said, "Owen, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. I love you. That doesn't change, and it won't change. But I'm 61 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that love is not the same thing as trust. You don't rebuild trust with a conversation. You rebuild it with time and with choices. If you're willing to do that, I'm willing to see where we end up." He nodded. He said, "Okay." He left. We talk now, occasionally, carefully. I don't know what his marriage looks like from the inside, and I've stopped trying to guess. I know that the Sunday calls haven't fully come back. I know that I spent Thanksgiving with Patsy and her family next door, and it was one of the better Thanksgivings I can remember. The property is still mine. The creek still runs behind the house, and if it's quiet enough in the evening, you can hear it from the porch. I had the workshop resided this past summer and put in better lighting. I finished a project I'd been putting off for 2 years, a small footbridge over the low part of the creek, made from reclaimed oak. Nothing fancy. Solid, the kind of thing that takes patience and precision and doesn't need to announce itself. A lot of people, when they hear something like this, want to know if I'm angry. And I understand why they ask. I spent a lot of money. I was lied to by my son. I sat in the 7th row at a wedding I funded, and then spent months watching the people I loved most try to quietly take the ground from under my feet. But anger is expensive. I learned that in 30 years of engineering, the projects that failed were the ones where emotion drove decisions. The projects that lasted were built on measurements, on patience, on knowing exactly what you're working with before you commit to a design. I measured carefully. I was patient. I committed when I knew exactly what I was working with. The bridge I built over that creek isn't going anywhere. I want to say one more thing, and it's this. If you are someone who is being told you are too old to manage your own affairs, at 60, at 65, at 70, I want you to understand that age is not a condition, and it is not a disqualifier. Wisdom is not something that happens to you when you're young and fades when you're old. It accumulates, it compounds, and the people who try to convince you otherwise, who try to make you feel slow or confused or incapable, they are not worried about your well-being. They are worried about what you still have. Don't let them convince you to give it away. I've been thinking about what I would tell someone who's standing where I was standing 2 years ago, holding an envelope they didn't expect, realizing that the person they loved most had made a decision they couldn't take back. I don't have a clean answer for that, but I have what I learned, and I think that's worth saying out loud. The thing about cause and effect is that it doesn't care about your intentions. Owen and Sloan believed they were being smart. Maybe they even believed in some version of events they told themselves that what they were doing was practical, efficient, that I was old enough and alone enough that no one would look too closely. Every decision they made, the forged application, the manufactured pressure, the lie about my attorney, each one of those was a cause. And causes don't disappear. They just wait for their effects to arrive. I didn't set out to be clever. I set out to be careful. There's a difference, and I think it matters. Clever is about outsmarting someone. Careful is about knowing what you have and not being careless with it. I'd spent 32 years as an engineer because I understood that structures fail when people get sloppy, when they skip a measurement, assume something is fine without checking, let emotion make a decision that math should be making. I applied the same discipline to my own situation. I documented. I verified. I didn't react until I knew exactly what I was reacting to. That's not a gift I was born with. That's something I built over decades of choosing patience over impulse and precision over speed. What I want people to take from Theodore's story, from my story, is that intelligence isn't just what you know. It's what you do when you're under pressure. Anyone can think clearly when nothing is at stake. The real test is whether you can slow down when every instinct is telling you to speed up. When your son is sitting across the kitchen table with a folder and a notary on standby, and everything in you wants to either sign or explode, can you just say, "Let me take a few days"? That's not weakness. That's the only move that protects you. And character, real character, shows up in what you do when no one is watching and no one will know. I could have confronted Owen the moment I suspected something. I could have caused a scene, cut him off, made it loud. Instead, I kept my voice even, kept writing in my notebook, kept showing up as the same person I had always been, not because it felt good, but because it was right. Because I knew that the day the truth came out, I wanted to be the person who had behaved well through all of it. Owen is still my son. Sloan is still his wife. I don't know how that story ends. But I know how mine does, and mine ends with the creek still running behind my house, the bridge I built still standing over it, and the property still in my name. That's enough for me. That's more than enough.